Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world right now, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and of course elsewhere. But if you had to choose one bilateral relationship that is perennially more important than all the others, it would probably have to be the US-China relationship. The competition between Asia's rising superpower and the leader of the Western world is becoming more and more global in nature. It seems these days to stretch into almost every corner of the world. So we're going to look at how changes and potential changes in the US-China relationship are affecting and may affect issues in other parts of the world. We'll be going to talk about trade, Taiwan, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea, and several other issues and regions. So let me come to you first, Dimitri, if I may. You've had a string of excellent scoops in your coverage of US-China of late. Could I ask your assessment as a kind of a range-finding exercise on how the US-China relationship is right now? There was a summit in San Francisco in November last year between Xi Jinping, China's leader, and Biden. Did that improve the relationship in any substantial way?
Thank you, James, and good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I think my take on San Francisco was that it was a very welcome development in that having the two leaders of the two global superpowers in the same room talking is good for everyone. It's something the US wanted, the Chinese wanted, and I think US allies and partners wanted. But I think the outcome, from my perspective, what we got was a tactical pause in what is an increasingly tense strategic rivalry for different reasons. As the US was worried that things were getting a little bit too out of control in terms of rhetoric about Taiwan. The US is also facing elections in November. And China, on the other hand, has got economic problems. And so it doesn't want to have a huge array of other issues to deal with, if possible. The two leaders reached some agreements, notably on fentanyl, where the Chinese agreed to stop or to make it more difficult for Chinese companies to export the ingredients used to make this deadly synthetic opioid to the US. And they agreed to restart military-to-military relations, which have been halted after Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan in 2022 when she was still the US House Speaker. I think the most positive outcome from the summit, and it's not clear if it's directly related, is that the Chinese fighter jets over the last 7 months haven't conducted any of what the Americans called risky and coercive intercepts of US surveillance planes off the Chinese coast. There was a real danger that one of these close intercepts would lead to an accident at some point. But I think overall, the fundamental tensions between the two countries remain, and in some cases are likely to get worse, most importantly, Taiwan, which I know we're going to talk about. And then finally, in the short term, I think we have escalating tensions in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines that has the potential to spark an incident that could, in the worst case scenario, trigger the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. So I think overall, with a tactical pause in some of the rivalry, but I'm an optimist by nature, but I don't see very many positive signs on the horizon in the US-China relationship.
Interesting, yes. And as you mentioned, Dimitri, we're going to be coming to the US election at the end of the year and the implications that that will have for the relationship with China. But Rory, could I turn to you, because Taiwan really is, I suppose, the cornerstone issue in the US-China relationship. So much seems to start with how the two countries are feeling about Taiwan. And recently, as everybody knows, we had the election of Lai Ching-te as president of Taiwan, and he took office on May the 20th. Could you give us a run through on the sense of whether Taiwan is exerting tension into the US-China relationship right now, whether it's fairly stable? What's the picture with Taiwan?
Well, thanks so much for having me, James. It's really great to be here to talk about this subject, a subject I'm extremely passionate about. I think that there is a a lot of tension in the Taiwan Strait, and Lai's election and his inaugural speech is indicative of that tension and accelerating some of the dynamics of instability in the Taiwan Strait. But it's really important to remember that Lai's election, his inauguration, is a moment in a series of events and dynamics that have been building for a number of years. And it really does put pressure on the US-China relationship. Right now, the situation is that there is no dialogue between Beijing and Taipei about cross-Taiwan Strait relations at the official level, and there is no trust, none of the necessary kind of trust that would be enabling of that dialogue happening in the near term. This is not a new dynamic. The party in power in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, has been in power since 2016. There's been no official dialogue since 2016. But I think that the mistrust is deepening as Beijing sees Lai Ching-te as more independence-minded and more independence-leaning than the previous leader, Tsai Ing-wen. There's also a bigger dynamic here, which is the shifting balance of military power across the Taiwan Strait. Again, this is a dynamic that's been building for many years. It's not new to the relationship. But at this point, the ability of Taiwan to defend itself against attack from Beijing is under serious question. And that calls the US into the equation. This is a security dilemma. Beijing on one hand, Taipei on the other hand, both see their own moves as defensive and reactive in nature, but the other side is interpreting them as offensive or escalatory. And it's important to remember that these are all choices that the governments are making. There's certainly a world in which Beijing and Taipei can have a dialogue. Maybe there's even a world in which the DPP government and Beijing can have a dialogue despite the DPP's inclusion of independence in their party plank. And I do think that the US-China diplomatic relationship, particularly the process that was started in Bali and is continuing between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, has created some reassurances on the Taiwan issue. That's overall calming down the dynamic in the Taiwan Strait as Beijing looks to the election in November and says, maybe we can wait and see and let the US political situation kind of determine how we look at the next 4 years of cross-strait relations.
Very interesting. Thank you. And just to say that we will be coming back to the Taiwan issue in a couple of questions' time, because overwhelmingly the most asked question by our audience today was on the chances of war between the US and China and the question of Taiwan. So we'll be exploring all of those with reference to the specific questions that were asked. But Ken, could you come in and tell us about how the US-China relationship is affecting the key geostrategic picture in the Indo-Pacific with reference to Japan, please? One of the issues, I think, is the extent to which Tokyo will be going along with US policy towards China in some of the, the economic sphere. We've seen US tariffs on electric vehicles, etc. So could you talk, could you bring us up to date with what's happening in the Indo-Pacific and Japan?
Right, thanks, James. I think there are 5 paths in front of Japan and the allies in general. I'll go through them very quickly. There are 2 good ones and 2 bad ones, and there's one wild card in between. So I'll start from the bad ones. The worst case scenario for Japan and the allies is World War III and everyone dies. The second worst scenario is great power collaboration, not great power competition, but great power collaboration between China and the US, a G2 in which America and China decide between themselves and the other countries fall in between the cracks. There's a third scenario, which I will come back to, which is the wild card. And the fourth scenario is a better one, which is what we have now, which is great power competition between the US and China. Japan and the allies rally around the US because we are united in defending the rules-based international order. China is trying to build its own new world order. So that's very clear, the structure. The best possible scenario number 5, is when China gives up, agrees to go by the free and open and rules-based current international order and vows peace. So that would be wonderful. The one in the middle, the third scenario, could be the most likely, especially if Donald Trump is reelected, and that is great power competition, but China is pursuing its new world order, but America is pursuing an America first order, and whatever policies America takes will be guided towards profiting American companies and strengthening American power. And if the allies want to come along, they can come along. So if we take the most recent incident in the South China Sea, where a Chinese boat and a Philippine boat collided, and apply them to those 5 scenarios: 1, we don't want a war. 2, the great power collaboration is problematic for Japan because there's no predictability. We don't know what the G2 will decide how to deal with this. The third option is also problematic for Japan because there is no clarity in the American stance. The Americans might say, this has nothing to do with America, it doesn't benefit America, so we're not intervening. The fourth scenario is much clearer, what we have now. America will apply the treaty with the Philippines to defend the Philippine ships. And the fifth scenario is peace, so we don't have to worry. So I think that's what lies in front of the allies now.
Right. And do you get the sense, Ken, staying with you, do you get the sense that Japan itself is moving toward more trade sanctions, trade tariffs with China? Or is there really quite a big difference between the Japanese attitude to trade with China and the US attitude towards trade with China?
I think the current situation is like Japan is trying to encourage China to play by the rules-based order, and if those American sanctions and tariffs are structured in a way to lead China into a more rules-based level playing field, then I think Japan would be going with that. But if it is, like I said, structured to profit American companies, that will be a little bit difficult for Japan to go on board. The CHIPS Act is kind of gray because it does strengthen America and its allies. But that's about as much as we can go. I don't think Japan will go all in an American first kind of structure.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think Europe is basically playing a similar type of strategy. One of the topics that we got a lot of interest in was, of course, who's going to win in the US at the end of the year. Is it going to be Trump? Is it going to be Biden? But rather than try and predict that, could we ask Dimitri first, I think, to say, if Trump wins, if Biden wins, what will be the impact on US-China relations, please?
Well, I think in some ways it might be easier to predict who's going to win the US election than to get inside Xi Jinping's head and work out which candidate he would like to win. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting to me, and this is purely anecdotal, is overall, I think it's unclear to me which candidate China prefers. I mean, when you talk to Chinese diplomats and officials who are doing kind of more foreign policy, my sense is they tend to think Biden would be easier to deal with because he's more predictable. You can see already what he's done over the last 3.5 years, and I think most people assume he would continue in the same direction. So even though China doesn't like the US policies under Biden, it's easier to respond to them if you kind of know what's coming down the pipeline. On the other hand, when you talk to Chinese military officials, PLA officers, again, anecdotally, they tend to seem to prefer Trump. And if you ask them why, they will often say because they think Trump doesn't care about Taiwan and he would be willing to do a deal with China where he kind of sold out on Taiwan. But it's unclear, if if Biden wins, I think we can expect more or less the same kind of policies that we have right now. Tough stance on China, continuing with export controls, tough rhetoric on things that are happening in the South China Sea, etc., and a continuation of a policy to bolster and strengthen U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific. If Trump wins, we don't know. I mean, Trump had 3 phases on China when he was president. The first year, Xi Jinping was his best friend. Then he had a trade war for the second and third year, but didn't do a huge amount on national security. And in his final year, when he was getting blamed for his handling of the COVID pandemic, he opened the floodgates, and his national security officials were essentially allowed to do most of the aggressive and assertive measures that they had wanted to do the whole time. So will Trump come back and pick up where he left off 4 years ago? Or will he do something that kind of Ken alluded to? Will he try and do some kind of a big deal with Xi Jinping and then have a US-China G2, which is something that, you know, Japan and many of the other US allies would be worried about? And frankly, as it goes with many things regarding President Trump, we have no idea which tack he'll take when he comes back. So I think, you know, if you just one small example, you know, Trump tried to ban TikTok when he was president, but now he is pushing back against US efforts to ban TikTok and saying that anything that hurts TikTok will help Facebook, and Facebook is his new enemy. So that's just one simple example of how Trump pivots and flip-flops on things. So really, we're going to have to wait and see, and so will Xi Jinping.
Yes, exactly. I personally had a meeting with a Chinese official the other day who said things that are very similar. I mean, to sum up, he said that China wouldn't mind Trump because the size of Trump's ego makes him easier to manipulate. I'm not sure if that's the case, but anyway, that was one take. Rory, coming to you then, what's your sense of this? What's your sense of how this plays into strategic mistrust, competition, etc.?
Well, I think, you know, neither choice is great for China if its goal is to pursue its economic and security interests through force or coercion. There's definitely bipartisan support for defending U.S. interests against unfair practices that China has. And I think maybe the most recent tariffs on Chinese EVs is a good example of how the political dynamics are playing now and telegraphs what might be happening after the election. Big EV tariffs and just big tariffs in China in general were floated by the Trump campaign, and then the Biden administration is enacting very similar 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. But if you look at the difference in the Trump and Biden approach here, to underscore what Dimitri had already said about the reliance of Biden more on U.S. alliances, you know, the Biden administration has also lobbied and I think successfully lobbied for Europe to join these EV tariffs, albeit at a much reduced rate, something near 35%. You know, Trump is very much more focused on the bilateral relationship, less interested in seeking stability, but he also pulls the U.S. out of important global governance initiatives. And that can be a vacuum in which, you know, China can step and has stepped well into over time. So you know, a Trump administration, a 2.0 might be more volatile, hostile, but they would have more room to fill that global governance vacuum. A Biden 2.0 might be more stable as Biden's really prioritized communication. And I think going back to the EV tariffs, certainly an understanding that overcapacity was flagged many, many times in these high-level diplomatic meetings before the tariffs were announced. So you might have more of a no surprises with Biden, much tougher on the alliance network, versus Trump, surprises everywhere, but perhaps more room to manipulate larger global governance initiatives.
Very interesting. It's interesting that both you and Dimitri don't have a particularly, I mean, there isn't much optimistic to look forward to, really, regardless of who takes power. As I mentioned, we've had a lot of questions coming in from the audience. The ones that I'm about to summarize here come from Riatna Gio in Singapore, Slavomir Karazinski in Poland, Harvadi Hendarko in Indonesia, Noboru Inoue in Japan. And basically, the topic is whether or not US-China rivalry is creating wins for other countries in the region. I mean, just to give you an example, of course, we've seen Apple invest heavily in India. I believe there are two big, there are several suppliers of Apple in India that are creating a critical mass to assemble iPhones over there. We're also seeing a lot of action in terms of electric vehicle factory investment going into Indonesia. We've seen a lot of similar type of investment going into the Philippines. Singapore is becoming a center for Chinese activity, often with regard to things like private equity in Southeast Asia. So Ken, could you take us forward a bit on that, please? Are you seeing a kind of an invigoration of Southeast Asia and India in the manufacturing sphere because of the rivalry between the US and China?
Yeah, I had a breakfast with a Malaysian diplomat the other day, and he was saying the US-China rivalry is a godsend for Malaysia because there is a keen interest among Western countries to move out of China and look for alternative destinations. So I think there will be a competition between India, Vietnam, Malaysia, all these countries to compete for these factories coming out of China. And it will be a competition over political stability. They will try to showcase that they are politically stable. There's prevalence of English language, the ease of doing business, and maybe sustainability. So there will be a competition among these countries for that. But I also think it's important to understand China's long-term strategy when it comes to technology and innovation. I think Xi Jinping sees innovation and technology as the key ingredient to elevating China to great power status. They've tried wolf warrior diplomacy to try to tell everybody that China is big already. Now that didn't work. They've tried economic coercion on Australia, Canada. That didn't really strengthen China's position. But I think they know that if they continue to innovate, countries around the world would have no alternative but to come to China for the latest technology. And they would, like the US, I read in a book the other day, to become an English-speaking Latin America, where they would export commodities and energy and have maybe tourism, but not the latest innovation. So that's the kind of worldview Xi Jinping envisions, I think. And the latest tariffs on EVs in Europe and America are reflection of a fear to that future and making sure that China doesn't dominate in certain technologies. And I think that kind of decoupling is going to go ahead, and companies have to keep that in mind as they decide on their investments.
Right. So decoupling has to go ahead. Just staying with you, Ken, for a minute. Decoupling has to go ahead, and that is unfolding. Slavomir Karazinski asks a very interesting question, which is that could there be actually a break in the global supply chain because US-China rivalry intensifies? In other words, could this be a real rupture for the global economy if tensions between the US and China grow so intense that they basically stop trading with each other?
Yeah, so there was a piece released today in Foreign Affairs by Robert O'Brien, who is the National Security Advisor to Trump. And his main point on China is that we have to decouple, and that there is the Biden administration has sent mixed messages of trying to strengthen and protect America's core competence, but also not flaming the tensions too much with China. O'Brien argues that it has to be much more clearer and that decoupling is the future. And like I said, although China, Xi Jinping talks of his opposition to decoupling and de-risking now, I think in the long term, his view is to have China as the dominant tech player So they will be going full speed ahead to have their own self-sufficient tech ecosystem that is not dependent on the US. I think it's inevitable that we are heading into a decoupling world.
Right, very interesting. And just we're going to go back to Taiwan now, but of course there is a link between the integrity of the global supply chain and Taiwan. First of all, Taiwan sits right at the middle of the global tech supply chain, is absolutely crucial to everything that happens in technology, particularly in semiconductors. And it's also the center of the US-China geopolitical tensions. So Taiwan's absolutely front and center. I would argue that whatever is happening in Taiwan, it creates significant impetus for decoupling, as Ken has been describing. So perhaps we could go back to that. As I mentioned at the beginning, by far the most asked question by our audience was, will there be a war between the US and China? What is the outlook for the tensions surrounding Taiwan? Just to mention a few names of people who asked questions in that in that broad area: Lester Lee, John Rixa, Joy Perez Ortega, Xu Gang, Sekar Ramamurthy. So perhaps I could come to you first, Rory. What's your sense of this? Some of the specific questions we've been asked is, what is the risk of hot war versus cold peace? And another related question is China going to attack or blockade Taiwan in coming years? Some of the people who wrote in said that might happen in 2027. Others seem to think it might happen in 2025. I imagine it'll be very difficult to put a date on, but could you take us through those issues, please?
Absolutely. Well, I think when it comes to the timeline, Xi Jinping told Joe Biden in Woodside last November that there is no timeline to take Taiwan by force. And I take him at his word, not because I'm a mind reader or because anybody knows what's going on inside Xi Jinping's head, but because it tracks with China's long-term policies and objectives on Taiwan. China's objective on Taiwan remains peaceful unification. And I think it's important to remember in this highly charged political atmosphere that no one actually wants to go to war. Taipei is not ready in any sense of the word to handle a Chinese invasion. China doesn't feel it is ready to handle a successful invasion of Taiwan. And the US absolutely does not want to get involved in this issue militarily. So I don't think there's a timeline for taking Taiwan by force in Beijing. But I do think there are red lines. And the question of whether or not there's going to be war in the Taiwan Strait really has to do with, does anybody cross these red lines? China's made very clear what it would take to invoke force against Taiwan. It has codified it in its own 2005 anti-secession law, and there are two main clauses. One is that Taiwan declares formal independence, so political declaration of independence. The second clause or justification would be that all routes to peaceful unification are exhausted. That one for me is a little bit more salient. I think that it's very subjective who decides if all peaceful routes have been exhausted. And I think it's really interesting to look at China's courting of Taiwan's opposition parties in this regard. It's certainly possible that while the kind of dialogue between the CCP and the opposition KMT in Taiwan can be seen as perhaps cleaving, parting, separating Taiwan internally, it's also really important in Beijing and in China's domestic political narrative to say, no, we still have friends in Taiwan. There's still a pathway here to peaceful unification. And then I think that it's also important to remember with this timeline, which has really come from the US policy community, these dates that are being thrown out, 25, 27, these are being generated inside the US policy community to call attention to a rising threat perception that if China were to attack Taiwan, it would be increasingly difficult to guarantee that US involvement would be successful. These are worst case scenarios. They are definitely scenarios that consider China's military capabilities far above its intentions, and perhaps even confuse capabilities for intentions. And it's simply not a threat perception that's shared by the people of Taiwan, who seem to interpret this military pressure as a political signal. So I encourage everyone who's thinking about timelines or speaking about timelines to really think, what is the effect this is having on Taiwan? I mean, what's happening in part of this bigger US-China decoupling conversation, but also this conversation about the risk of war in Taiwan, is that global multinationals are concerned about their Taiwan presence. They're starting to de-risk. And that has a real significant deleterious effect on Taiwan's economy. So I'm not sure that thinking of things in terms of timelines is really fit for purpose here. We've got to start thinking about red lines and making sure that everybody can communicate those red lines clearly and can be careful if they're inching toward the red lines to pull themselves back.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I often hear people say that the key to stability in the US-China relationship is clear red lines. If everybody knows each other's red lines, then of course they can aim off for those red lines. But Dimitri, you've reported a great deal about Taiwan, US, China. You had a cracking scoop the other day on Xi Jinping telling Ursula von der Leyen of the EU that the US was trying to goad China into taking some action against Taiwan. Could you just interpret that for us? Maybe give us a bit more details on what was said, but also what does it mean in terms of the stability situation across the Taiwan Straits?
Well, so I mean, it was interesting because this is the first known example publicly of Xi Jinping saying this to a foreign leader, to the president of the European Commission. Chinese scholars and retired Chinese military officers, have for a long time talked about the Taiwan trap or Taiwan bait, which is that the US is doing things to help Taiwan, selling it weapons, supporting it in other ways that may result in China thinking at some point that a red line has been crossed, and then, as Rory said, forcing China to take military action. Now, no one in the US government that I talk to, I mean, even the most hawkish of hawks, I think want a war over Taiwan. So I think to a certain extent that argument is paranoid. The question is, does Xi Jinping really believe that? Why did he say that? Is it possible, for example, to put out one theory, that some of his inner circle think that Xi Jinping is too strident on Taiwan. And so by telling him that he would be falling into an American trap by doing something on Taiwan might cause him to pull back a little bit. But that's just one theory, and you could come up with any number of theories. So the truth is we really don't know. But to get back to what Rory said, which I think is really important, I mean, the dates on a timeline were thrown out by various American generals and admirals. The only one that wasn't thrown out, by the way, is 2026. So watch out for 2 years down the road. The Pentagon eventually told those generals and admirals, no more timelines in public. This is actually creating a very tense and dangerous situation and leading China to believe that maybe something is in the works on the American side. I think Admiral John Aquilino, who recently stepped down as the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, he said in his final congressional testimony that his peers who were throwing out dates were actually just guessing. And I think actually that was a very important statement that should have got more coverage. Ultimately, whether there's a conflict over Taiwan will depend on the triggers that Rory was talking about. Either the Taiwanese president declares independence and forces China's hand, or, which I also agree with Rory, the most interesting scenario is, does China at some point decide that peaceful unification or reunification, depending on what side of the fence you're on, the chances of that are exhausted, and that is very subjective. So, one thing at the moment, which I think explains why the Chinese, in the 4 months between William Lai's election and his inauguration, things were actually, relatively, I wouldn't say calm, but, not as heated as they could have been, was because the opposition party got more seats in the legislature. So China can tell itself a narrative, which is, yes, the more pro-independence party won the presidency, but actually the more pro-Beijing party did better in the legislature. So, the Taiwanese will ultimately come around to the view that unifying with China is the smart move. But, I think that there are so many wild cards in this equation. And again, if Donald Trump is elected, what he does on Taiwan is going to be crucial. If you think back in 2016, when he was elected, he actually had a phone call with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, which was hugely controversial. But at other times, he has said Taiwan is just a small rock in the Pacific Ocean. Why would the U.S. Be concerned about Taiwan? So big unknowns, or known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld used to say. And again, only time will tell.
That's very.
James,
Yes, of course.
Can I come with a finger on this?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. In terms of Xi Jinping's comments that the U.S. is goading China into attacking Taiwan, I think this is really significant and interesting. On the one hand, I think it should be reassuring because it really is trying to separate China's intentions from its political and military pressure. It's posturing these moves as defensive, as reactive. And I think that that's important to understanding where China is coming from and really considering, its own perspective on this. But on the other hand, it's marking strategic mistrust of the US as a really politically salient narrative inside China. So on the one hand, kind of taking away some of the immediate pressure about attacking Taiwan. On the other hand, these long-term dynamics are certainly deepening, and I believe it is in response to some political signal inside China that is leaning toward greater and greater strategic mistrust over time. And then one final point here on Taiwan. I am now hearing more and more concern about the prospects of a Trump and Lai dynamic. I think that the Chinese really feel that Lai and his administration are good at manipulating Americans, that Trump is highly manipulatable, and that some of his former officials, for example, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have come out and made very forward comments on Taiwan, including Taiwan is already an independent sovereign country and we should recognize that. So I think for China, those uncertainties are looming really large in their minds right now, and they're trying to pre-plan how to deal with that if the reins are off and Trump is leaning towards having some of those officials come back into a next administration.
So I'll come to you in just one sec, Ken. So Rory, just going back to the question that was asked by the first questioner, hot war or cold peace, it sounds to me like you think there's a danger of hot war. I don't want to put words into your mouth.
There is a non-zero chance of hot war, but I personally believe that the constraining factors, including the absolutely devastating effect this would have on the global economy. I mean, we started talking about Taiwan as a linchpin in the global tech economy. Let's also consider that a vast majority of the world's shipping goes through the Taiwan Strait. I mean, this is a major lane for commercial activity. It is not simply a military arena. So the immediate devastating effects of Taiwan blockade or a war over Taiwan, I think, is a real constraining factor that doesn't get enough attention in the media and often in the minds of policymakers.
Well said. Ken, what's your sense?
Yeah, so I agree with Rory that Dimitri's scoop about what she told von der Leyen is very important. And I think Xi Jinping truly believes that the U.S. is goading China to invade Taiwan, because if you put yourselves in the shoes of American military leaders or the Pentagon, if you're going to fight anyway, you might as well fight today, because with each passing day, the likelihood of America winning goes down because of China's military expansion. I kind of sensed that when Nancy Pelosi landed in Taiwan in 2022. There was this hype from the Chinese media that China would not stand by quietly, and they would either shoot down the plane or make the plane land in Japan or South Korea. At the end of the day, China did nothing. Of course, afterwards, they came out with like training and all that. But on that day, the China didn't do anything, couldn't do anything, because I think if they had, China just wasn't ready to fight a war. And I think China only has one chance to fight a war over Taiwan. And if they don't win, that could be the end of the CCP. It would definitely be the end of the Xi Jinping regime. That's not to say that there will not be a war over Taiwan and that Xi Jinping does not intend to invade. I think that taking in Taiwan is a culmination of the Xi Jinping's new era. When the China dream becomes reality, and that would be the day, in China's eyes, that Pax Americana ends and Pax Sinica begins. But that day is not today. That's what I thought.
Yes, absolutely. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I do want to get to some of the economic issues, but we've got an interesting question that's just come in from Bing Zhou, and this is on geopolitics. So before we leave geopolitics, could I ask one of you to take this one, please? The question is, will the US-China relationship harden the alliance between China, Russia, and other players that will further destabilize the world order? I don't know who would like to take that. Dimitri, you're slightly nodding your head. Do you think it's going to harden that relationship, or what?
I think, the China-Russia relationship, while it's not a formal alliance at the moment, is only going to get stronger and stronger. And I think as the US, again, assuming that US policies continue as they are right now, if the US is going to continue bolstering alliances, creating what they call, minilateral deals, where you have the US encouraging Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, so its allies to actually work more with each other, not just more with the US. That is a growing threat to China. Increases, Pax America, and I think makes it more likely that the Chinese and the Russians move closer together, because ultimately they see that as, opposed to their interests in the world. So I think the trend lines in that sense are pretty clear, unless something dramatic changes.
Excellent, thank you. So going to some of the more economic questions, though, of course, these are all shot through with the geopolitical issues that we've just been talking about. We've had a question or a couple of questions from Jerry Kan in Singapore and Dinu Tionga from Romania. So the issue here is, what is the outlook for the big US companies in China, many of the Fortune 500 are in China. In fact, I would say probably all of them. And a lot of them, including the American companies, are making handsome revenues and profits in the China market. So if US-China tensions increase, as they appear to be doing, Ken, what's your sense of the way forward? I mean, what's going to happen there?
Right. I think we addressed this with the decoupling question a bit a while ago. I just want to add to the Russia-China dimension. I don't agree that there's this axis of upheaval of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran emerging. I don't think that's what China wants. Well, first of all, if Trump is elected, I think one of the first phone calls he will have will be with Kim Jong-un. And in this phone call, he's going to promise to go to Pyongyang. And when he does go to Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un is going to sweeten the Hanoi deal just a little bit, and Trump is going to take it. And then that's the end of the axis. Also, I think the reason why China sees Russia Xi Jinping sees Russia very useful now is that I think Xi Jinping really sees an opportunity to mediate a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's the moment that Chinese officials have been waiting for since Xi made that very big mistake of declaring a no limits partnership with Putin when everybody else was criticized Putin. It put him on his back foot. It didn't look good. But if he is able to mediate a ceasefire now, the Chinese could say, look, it was because of Xi's wisdom not to burn bridges with Putin. That's why China was the only player who could bring these two together. It was something that the US could not do, and it would show his view of great power diplomacy, and it would put the global south behind him, and it would pave the way for him to for a fourth term, I think. Because he doesn't have much to show for in his 12 years in power so far. So I think that's why he sees Russia as very beneficial now, not that he's trying to create a world comfortable for autocracies with Russia.
Right. Dimitri, just coming to you quickly on this economic question. We've seen, obviously, the rise of Chinese technology companies. It's been quite an impressive trend over the last few years. Do you have any sense of whether the US sanctions on China, particularly in areas such as semiconductors, some other technologies as well, is only impelling Chinese companies to develop their own homegrown alternatives? I'm talking about, Harmony OS, the Kirin 9000 chip recently from SMIC, and there are several others as well. Do you think there's a danger that, in fact, this US punitive policy towards China may end up over time by strengthening China as a tech power?
Well, I think that's one of the big debates in the community in Washington is whether this experiment that the US is undertaking, which Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, calls small yard, high fence, where you have a yard of cutting edge technologies that you don't want the Chinese to get because it'll help their military, and you build a high fence around those to make it more difficult for Beijing to access that technology or to access the tools needed to make those technologies. I think, at the moment, there's a mixed record. So I think in some ways the US export controls have hurt China for sure. You can see that in the way that Chinese companies, when they started to read stories in the media about the Biden administration planning to introduce some of these export controls, which started really in October 2022, they started stockpiling key components and semiconductors that they would need. On the other hand, China is very nimble. And so a really stark example of where the US measures may be backfiring is when Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was visiting China last year. While she was in China, Huawei rolled out one of its latest high-end smartphones, which had a much more advanced semiconductor in it than many American officials believed would have been possible. So the question is, Huawei is like a poster child for US-China tech competition. America has done as much as it can to prevent Huawei from being able to do certain kind of things and access certain technologies. And yet the company has rebounded and is doing arguably better today than it was, 5 years ago. But this is an experiment where we really won't know for some time. But I think what the American response, if they were pushing back on what I just said, is, well, yes, ultimately China will get to where it needs to be at some point in the future. But if we can slow them down for any number of years, well, then that's a positive thing. And it partly ties into something Ken was saying, which I slightly disagree with, which is there's a view in the American military that actually, and this is one of the reasons the kind of invasion of Taiwan by 2027 theory took hold, is that the US military is actually relatively weaker in the Western Pacific right now than it will be in 10 years' time. That China has certain advantages now that the US thinks it can shrink that gap in a decade. So part of what the US is trying to do on the technology front is make it harder for the Chinese military to develop more sophisticated weapons over the next decade, allow the US to close some of the gaps that it faces, and then actually have a stronger position if Xi Jinping in, for example, 2035 decided for whatever reason that he wanted to invade Taiwan. So I think it's a process of slowing China down, but there is this, the other side of the coin, which is it actually making China more nimble and finding ways to be more creative to overcome or circumvent the US export controls.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I recently spent a while in Shenzhen for an FT podcast called Tectonic. We were looking at China's rise as a tech superpower, and I must say, my big takeaway was the speed at which China is progressing in technological advance really is quite dramatic, and the cost of these very high value, very high tech products that China's producing is really unbelievable. But just turning to a different question, Rory, perhaps you could take this one. We've got 9 minutes left, and I do want to get in one of the questions that's just come in. But you mentioned earlier red lines, and you've been talking about how the US and China should conduct this relationship. Do you feel there are any factors that could emerge to help US-China relations? Are there things that both sides should do, either side should do? Could you take us through that? By the way, that specific question comes in from Liu Xiaowei.
Thanks for the question. I think there's room and avenues for the US and China to cooperate, although it's getting increasingly difficult. Part of the reason it's getting so increasingly difficult is because of this conversation we've just been having on economic security. I mean, in the US particularly, the logic of economic security has really changed over the past 35 years. We used to see our economic security as tied to a deepening process of globalization. And at some point, there was a shift in saying, actually, the net negatives of globalization are outweighing the positive benefits of globalization. And so there's been kind of a push and pull, a tug on this economic relationship to right-size it for American interest groups, to defend our industrial base, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that there's no areas of cooperation between the US and China. I think the major motivating factor right now is public image. It's not doing things together for the sake of one side or the other, or because they're in each other's mutual interest. It's really, how does this look to the rest of the world that both sides think they need in order to successfully navigate this emerging strategic rivalry? So areas for cooperation include global public health. There's a lot of room, actually, for the US and China to collaborate on innovative cancer treatment. The two countries have concentrated the highest amount of cancer patients in the world, and if clinical trials could be harmonized, could bring effective drugs to market faster. I think the fentanyl cooperation is another area where the entire globe benefits from US-China cooperation on anti-drug trafficking. Securing nuclear material is also an area where the US and China have worked together in the past and could do more in the future. So there certainly are areas of, practical global governance. And maybe I'll throw one last one in, which is food security, food and energy security, being, a topic that is particularly salient in the countries where the US and China are competing for influence and access. So as long as the motivating factor and the net benefit is to improve the public image of these two major powers in the world, there's a lot of room for finding that practical areas of cooperation. But they're probably at this point not transformative of the overall relationship. They're very motivated by public image.
Thank you very much. I think that's the first hopeful thing I've heard in this webinar. So well done for that. Ken, you put your hand up, and I've got a question here also on the South Korean-Japanese relations, if you're willing to take that. But what would you like to say?
No, I just wanted, on the positives, I think America has to stop trying to wish Xi Jinping would become more Western, because although there is this dismissal of the engagement policy, at the end of the day, I don't think much has changed. They still hope that China becomes more Western. So let's go back to the Chinese intention of mediating a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. American officials criticized China for not coming to the Swiss peace conference last week. But if China is willing to mediate a ceasefire, should the US accommodate that? Because if that's Xi's goal, and if she believes that is crucial to his fourth term, then I think there should be a discussion, a very strategic discussion of, okay, if that's what he wants, should we let him take credit for that in return for more strategic gains? The big question that people have to talk about is, should the US try to prevent a Xi Jinping fourth term, or decide that is probably inevitable? How do you leverage that to our advantage? I think there is this tendency in America to think, oh, well, if this wolf warrior dictator Xi goes away, then the next Chinese leader will be more pro-Western and pro-democratic. I'm not quite sure about that. Xi Jinping's track record for the past 12 years shows that he's very reluctant to go to war. So that might be one consideration. Whether if the goal is to prevent a war in Taiwan in the next 5 years, maybe a fourth Xi term might be beneficial for that. I think there should be discussion about stuff like that.
Thank you. Could you briefly, I think I've come to, I've got one for Vietnam for Dimitri. We can hopefully just squeeze in a second. Dimitri's a former South China correspondent, so maybe that's applicable. But on South Korean-Japanese relations influencing US-China relations, Ken, this one comes in from Matthew Kennedy at the University of Warwick. Do you see the improvement in South Korean and Japanese relations influencing US-China relations? Is there a link there?
Yes, and it also it's a very crucial, probably one of the most consequential changes to happen in the Indo-Pacific in the past 5 years is the reconciliation between Japan and South Korea. I hope it continues. My wife is South Korean, so for my household, I hope it continues. It very much depends on the American administration. The Biden administration is very keen on this trilateral relationship. If Trump changes that, it could fall apart. I just hope it continues.
Okay, and Dimitri, last word to you. We've just got a couple of minutes left. So the question is, does the US appreciate the regional dynamics in Southeast Asia between Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar? If Vietnam is positioned closer to the US, how will that affect the relations with the other countries? That's not exactly what you look at day to day in Washington, but as I say, you do have experience in the region.
Well, while I think about that, let me just make one quick point on the Japan-South Korea question. Just to point out that the US really pushed the Japanese and South Koreans to engineer this reconciliation and had a trilateral summit at Camp David, precisely because they feel that having Japan and South Korea closer together helps the US in its rivalry against China. So I think it's something where it's actually in everyone's interests of those three countries. On Vietnam and Southeast, I mean, the interesting thing about Southeast Asia, and I just came back from the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Forum in Singapore, is many, but not all of the countries in Southeast Asia welcome a US security presence in the region, but don't want to be forced to choose between the US and China, because when it comes to trade, China is just more important for all of the ASEAN countries. But you're seeing some interesting dynamics. I mean, for example, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, after Shangri-La, went to Cambodia, which has had closer and closer ties with China in recent years, because it has a new prime minister, Hun Manet, who's the son of Hun Sen, the former prime minister, and is a graduate of the West Point Military Academy and New York University. So the US, they are looking for an opportunity to try and pry Cambodia away from China over time. But, you know, all of these countries in Southeast Asia, at the end of the day, they have a huge neighbor, which is China. And no matter how much more they do with the US, they're going to have to look to Beijing and be careful what they do with the US, that it doesn't antagonize Beijing and lead to a damaging of their economic and trade relations. And that's not really answering the question, but it's the best I have for now.
It's actually a really good way to end this excellent webinar. Obviously, we're looking at a very bifurcated world, a very complicated world going forward.